They'll tell you it's the tulips, a bubble, a mania, a market that ate itself alive. That's the distraction. In 1602, Amsterdam didn't start building a trading company. It built a machine. Spice crates became collateral. Company shares became currency. A private fleet of armed warships enforced the contracts. They invented the stock exchange. They invented the central bank. They invented the debt instrument that let a city of merchants outgun every king in Europe. They didn't just play the game. They built the board and printed the money you had to use to sit at the table. By the time this video is over, you won't just know how Dutch history works. You'll recognize the prototype because it never stopped running. Welcome back to Hidden Forces in History. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand. We help our clients to appear on some of the biggest podcasts in the world. Check us out via the link in the description. And now, our story. So now let's go back not to 1602, before that, because to understand what Amsterdam built, you have to understand the world it built inside of. In the early 1500s, the most powerful commercial city in Europe wasn't Amsterdam. It was Antwerp. Antwerp sat at the intersection of everything. Portuguese spice ships offload their cargo on its docks. German banking families ran their northern operations from its counting houses. English wool merchants cut their deals on its exchange floors. By 1560, Antwerp was processing roughly half of all European trade. It was the center of the financial universe. And then Spain destroyed it. In 1576, unpaid Spanish troops mutinied and sacked the city. They burned buildings to the ground. They killed civilians in the streets. Historians call it the Spanish Fury. 8,000 people died in 3 days. Every merchant, every banker, every skilled craftsman who survived made the same calculation: leave. Most of them went north to Amsterdam. Amsterdam at that point was not impressive. It was a mid-sized port city sitting on the tidal river delta, built on wooden stakes driven into marshland. Most of it was below sea level, but it had two things that Antwerp had just lost: safety and freedom. The Dutch Republic had declared independence from Spain. It was governed not by a hereditary king, but a council of merchant regents. The men running the government were the same men running the trading houses. There was no separate nobility extracting rent from commerce. Commerce was the nobility. The Dutch Republic also had made a practical decision about religion. They were Calvinist. But they tolerated everyone else. Jewish merchants expelled from Portugal and Spain arrived in Amsterdam with trade contracts and capital networks stretching from Lisbon to Constantinople. Huguenot craftsmen fleeing France brought specialized skills in textiles, diamonds, and cartography. Flemish financiers from Antwerp brought the most sophisticated accounting methods in Europe. Protestant refugees from across the continent brought professional networks that functioned across borders. Amsterdam didn't build this expertise from nothing. It absorbed it from every financial direction and then organized it. By the 1590s, Dutch merchants were sailing to the East Indies. Spices were worth the risk. A single cargo of pepper or cloves could return 10 times its investment on every successful voyage. But the upfront cost was brutal. Building and provisioning an ocean-going fleet took 2 years of capital, tied up before a single coin came back. Arming it, because Portuguese warships were a constant threat, added to the cost. No single merchant house could sustain this alone. So they formed temporary partnerships, pool capital for one voyage, split the profits when the ships returned, dissolve, start over. This worked. But it created a serious secondary problem. Multiple competing Dutch companies were sailing to the same ports. They were bidding against each other for spices in Asia, driving the purchase price up. And when they returned to Amsterdam, they undercut each other on the sale, driving the selling price down. They were destroying their own market from both ends. The Portuguese, running a centralized royal monopoly for a century, watched the Dutch do this and held their position. Something had to change. In 1602, the Dutch States General made a decision that permanently changed the architecture of commerce. They forced the competing trading companies to merge. The result was the VOC, the United East India Company. And what they created wasn't just a bigger company. It was a new category of institution entirely. A corporation, not in the casual sense, in the precise legal sense. The VOC had corporate personhood. It could own property independently of its shareholders. It could sign treaties with foreign rulers. It could sue and be sued in court. It could build permanent infrastructure. It could also declare war. It could govern territory. It could execute criminals under its own legal jurisdiction. And it could survive the death of every single person who funded it. The company existed independently of its owners. This was not obvious before 1602. It is obvious now, because the VOC made it obvious. But the legal structure was only one piece. Before the VOC, investment in maritime trade worked like this. You committed capital to a single voyage. The voyage returned. Profits were distributed. The partnership dissolved. The capital came back to you. Then you started the negotiation again. Every venture was temporary. Capital was constantly being assembled, deployed, and returned. The VOC changed this permanently. Capital was now locked in. Shareholders didn't get their money back until the end of the voyage. They owned a stake in the ongoing enterprise, not a transaction, an enterprise. One that would keep deploying ships, keep building warehouses, keep paying officials and soldiers, keep negotiating treaties year after year, without stopping to dissolve and reconstitute. The machine ran continuously. The VOC was organized into 6 regional chambers. Amsterdam was dominant. It held 50% of the capital and controlled the agenda. The board, the Heren 17, the 17 Lords, governed the entire operation. They controlled what information reached which parties. They decided which routes were prioritized, which partnerships were formed, and which rulers were dealt with diplomatically, and which were dealt with otherwise. The 17 Lords weren't running a company. They were running a shadow foreign policy operation financed by private capital. There was one more innovation built into the VOC structure from the beginning: limited liability. If a VOC voyage failed, ships lost, cargo seized, crew killed, shareholders lost only what they had invested. They were not personally liable for the company's debts beyond that. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary in 1602. Before limited liability, investing in a venture meant full personal exposure. If the company's debts exceeded its assets, creditors could come for investors directly. Their homes, their other businesses, their personal wealth. The limited liability removed that downside. And when the personal downside is capped, people invested more. The VOC attracted thousands of shareholders who would never have touched a high-risk East Indies voyage under old rules. The architecture of risk had been redesigned. The VOC raised its initial capital through a public subscription. 6 million guilders offered to anyone who wanted to invest. Not just wealthy merchant families, anyone, a minor craftsman, a widow merchant's wife, a city official of modest means. 800 shareholders signed on. This was the first public stock offering in recorded history, and it immediately created a practical problem. If you're an ordinary Amsterdam resident who invested 50 guilders in the VOC, and you need that money back in 3 years, well, what would you do? The company isn't liquidating. There is no mechanism to withdraw. The solution was the Bourse, the exchange, a building in central Amsterdam where holders of VOC shares could sell them to other private parties. This was the invention of the secondary market, liquidity. Before this, investment was locked. You committed capital and waited. After this, capital could move. A VOC share was now an investment with a daily price, something that could be traded, something that could be posted as collateral for other deals, something that could be inherited, gifted, or sold in an emergency. Capital had been made fluid. The Amsterdam Exchange evolved rapidly. Within years, merchants were trading options, futures contracts, or the right to buy or sell VOC shares at a specialized price on a future date. You could bet the VOC shares would rise. You could bet that they would fall. You could profit either way, without actually owning a ship, without ever touching a spice crate. Finance had detached from physical commerce. Money could make money without handling a single physical good, not from trade, from bets on trade. They invented derivatives in 1602, the same instruments that would destabilize global markets 4 centuries later. The first major speculative attack came in 1609. Isaac Lemaire, a former VOC director, who had a falling out with the 17 lords over company policy, he left the board, and then he tried to destroy them from the outside. Lemaire assembled a syndicate. They borrowed VOC shares and sold them immediately, betting that the price would drop. Then they worked to make the price drop. They released pessimistic reports about the spice routes. They circulated rumors of lost ships. They talked down the company in every room that mattered. This was coordinated market manipulation, the first recorded short-selling campaign against a publicly traded company. The VOC went to the Dutch government immediately. In 1610, the States General issued a partial ban on short selling. Think carefully about what just happened. A private corporation used the power of the state to protect its own share price. The line between the VOC and the Dutch government was not clearly drawn. This was not an accident. Political power and financial power were not separate systems in Amsterdam. They were the same system operating through different hands. In 1609, the same year Lemaire launched his attack, Amsterdam built the second pillar of the machine, the Wisselbank, the Bank of Amsterdam. The problem it solved was practical. Amsterdam was the trading hub of Europe. Every nation's currency circulated in its markets. Spanish reals, English pounds, French livres, German thalers, Venetian ducats. Each coin had a different weight, a different silver content, a different exchange value. Merchants spent significant time and money calculating comparative values before any deal could be struck. The Wisselbank cut through this. You deposited your foreign coin at the bank. The bank gave you credit, a bank florin, a standardized unit of account. You could make payments to other Amsterdam merchants using bank florins. No haggling over coin quality. No currency conversion. Clean, reliable, fast. The bank florin became the reserve currency of the 17th century world. Every major trading house in Europe kept an account at the Wisselbank. Not because they were required to, because it made business faster and cheaper. Amsterdam had become the financial settlement infrastructure of global trade, and that infrastructure answered to Amsterdam. But the mechanic under the bank was more important than the florin itself. The Wisselbank was supposed to maintain full reserves. 1 florin backed by 1 florin's worth of coin in the vault. That was the stated policy, but that was not the reality. Secretly, and it stayed secret for over 100 years, the Wisselbank began extending credit beyond its actual reserves, to the city of Amsterdam directly, to the VOC when it needed emergency liquidity, to other preferred institutional borrowers. They were issuing bank florins that weren't fully backed by coin, lending money that didn't technically possess, because they understood a fundamental truth about banking. Not everyone withdraws at the same time. If you hold 10 guilders in deposits, you can safely lend out 7, as long as depositors don't demand their coin back. simultaneously. This is fractional reserve banking. It is the foundational mechanic of every modern central bank. Every commercial bank on Earth, the entire architecture of modern money. Amsterdam deployed it at scale first, and they hid it. Because the system only functions as long as people believe the system actually functions. Trust was the product. The coin was the prop. The relationship between the VOC and the Wisselbank was the world's first too-big-to-fail arrangement. When the VOC needed cash and the market couldn't provide it, the Wisselbank quietly extended credit. The bank's survival became entangled with the company's survival. By the 1780s, the VOC was hollowed out. Decades of mismanagement, corruption, and rising British competition had gutted its competitive position. When it failed, the Wisselbank's secret loan exposure became public. Depositors understood what had happened. Trust collapsed. The bank collapsed. The Dutch States General nationalized both institutions. This was 1795, 213 years before 2008. Same mechanics, same failure mode, same government intervention, different century. There's a third pillar, and it's the one most people miss entirely. The Dutch Republic borrowed money at a lower interest rate than any other state in Europe. By the mid-1600s, they were paying 4% on government bonds. England was paying 8 to 12%. France paid more. Spain defaulted so frequently that creditors priced in the probability before lending a single coin. The Dutch paid 4%. Why? Because they built a reputation for repayment. Every bond they issued, every time, no exceptions. In an era when royal death could invalidate a debt, when crowns canceled obligations by decree, when entire banking dynasties were destroyed by a sovereign default, the Dutch Republic paid. Merchants rewarded that reliability with low rates. The Dutch had invented something that wouldn't have a formal name for 2 centuries: sovereign credit rating. The compound advantage of this was decisive. If you borrow at 4% and invest at 8%, you control the spread. If your enemy borrows at 10% to fund the same war you're funding at 4%, well, they exhaust their treasury first. They raise taxes. They debase currency. They get rebellious at home. You issue another bond. When the Dutch fought their 80-year war of independence against Spain, one of the wealthiest empires in history, sitting on New World silver mines, they funded it primarily through bond issuances. Spain, with all its treasure, still couldn't keep its armies paid consistently. The Dutch, with a fraction of Spain's resources, issued paper and won. Debt as a weapon had a second dimension. When the Dutch merchants lent to foreign rulers, and they lent to everyone, those rulers became obligated. A king debt to Amsterdam, creditors couldn't easily make a war on Amsterdam. He needed access to the next loan. He needed the capital markets that Amsterdam controlled. Debt didn't just fund operations. It neutralized potential enemies. It created dependency structures that were more durable than military alliances. Alliances could be broken. Credit lines were harder to walk away from. The Dutch understood this early. They built it into the architecture deliberately. There is a dimension of the VOC that gets almost no attention: information. Every captain commanding a VOC vessel was required by company charter to submit detailed written reports upon return. Weather conditions along each route, port facilities, their depth, their limitations, the political situation of local rulers, which rulers were cooperative, which could be pressured, which military capacity worth respecting, commodity prices paid at each stop, commodity prices available, quality and quantity of goods at each port. These reports flowed back to Amsterdam, back to the 17 lords. They were read, analyzed, summarized, and filed. Over decades, the VOC built an information advantage that no competitor could replicate. They knew things, specifically before anyone else ever knew them. In the nutmeg harvest in the Banda Islands was larger than expected, The 17 lords knew this before the Amsterdam market had registered any change in supply. That advanced information let them position before the price moved, buy the competing inventory before others saw the surplus, or short the market before the drop became public. This is what we now call material non-public information. In 1610, it was good business. The VOC also managed supply actively. In years of abundant harvest, they didn't flood the market. They warehoused the surplus, or they burned it, deliberately. Spice crates set on fire to maintain price levels. This wasn't a market responding to supply and demand. This was a system manufacturing supply and demand. The VOC didn't respond to market conditions. It created them. The armed warships in the cold open weren't just a dramatic detail. They were the enforcement mechanism. At its peak, the VOC operated a fleet larger than most European national navies. It maintained a standing army of tens of thousands of soldiers. It built and garrisoned a network of fortified trading posts, stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to Nagasaki. This was not a defensive posture. This was the infrastructure of coercion. The VOC used military force to establish and maintain monopolies, not to protect existing trade, to own trade routes entirely. Any competitor, European or Asian, who tried to operate in VOC-controlled waters faced a company that could respond with warships, not a lawsuit, a warship. Jan Pedersen Cohen understood this logic better than anyone. Cohen was the VOC's governor general in the East Indies in the early 1600s. He built Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, as the company's permanent Asian headquarters. And in 1621, he solved what the company called the Nutmeg problem. The Banda Islands were the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew. The Bandanese had been trading nutmeg with multiple buyers for generations. The VOC wanted a monopoly. The Bandanese declined. Cohen's solution was systematic. He used VOC troops to kill or enslave the Bandanese population, approximately 15,000 people. He then divided the islands into plantation parcels, assigned each parcel to a Dutch colonist, forced enslaved labor to harvest the crop, and routed the nutmeg through VOC distribution at VOC prices. In Amsterdam, shareholders collected their dividends. They didn't ask about the Banda Islands. They read the return figures. The machine had solved a difficult problem. If you fund violet extraction at scale, without the investors having to confront it directly, well, you put a ledger between them and the consequences. You make the numbers the reality. And you put the reality somewhere far away. The corporation abstracted the violence, placed it at geographic and moral distance. This is not an accident of history. It was a feature of the design. The Dutch prototype didn't stay Dutch. In 1688, William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, was invited to take the English throne, the Glorious Revolution. He accepted. And when he sailed to England, Dutch financiers came with him. Dutch banking expertise arrived in London. The Dutch Playbook crossed the Channel. Within 6 years, England had built its version of the Wisselbank, the Bank of England, established in 1694. Same fundamental structure, a private institution given a monopoly on government banking, issuing credit backed by government debt, operating on fractional reserve principles, making the government permanently dependent on its creditors. The Bank of England was the Wisselbank rebuilt on the Thames. The English East India Company had existed since 1600. It predated the VOC by 2 years, but after 1688, its architecture shifted to mirror the Dutch model. Permanent capital structure, private military, territorial governance, treaty-making authority. The British absorbed the VOC's design and applied it at a different scale, not to a handful of spice islands, to an entire subcontinent, India, and eventually to a quarter of the planet's surface. Same machine, different operators, same playbook, bigger territory. The VOC was formally dissolved in 1799. The Wisselbank closed the same year. The Dutch commercial empire faded. And the prototype, well, that lived on. Not just survived, it became the default architecture of global finance. Every stock exchange operating today, New York, London, Tokyo, Shanghai, descends directly from the Amsterdam Bourse, the secondary market, the publicly traded share, real-time price discovery, derivative contracts allowing positions on future values without touching the underlying asset. This is not a modern innovation. They are 1602 innovations, running on faster hardware. Every central bank, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, operates on the principle the Wisselbank discovered: fractional reserve banking, credit by extension beyond hard reserves, a trust-dependent system that only functions as long as the trust holds. The Wisselbank hid its true reserve position from depositors for over a century. A modern central bank balance sheets are not exactly famous for their transparency. The institutions are different. The mechanisms are identical. The bond market, it's now the largest financial market in the world. Larger than equities, larger than derivatives. Sovereign debt, which are government bonds, is the foundation of modern economy, and the ability to borrow at low rates, backed by a credit line track record of repayment, will still the primary strategic weapon of economy-dominant states. The United States borrows in its own currency at rates no competitor can match because the world trusts it to pay. Same advantage the Dutch Republic built in the 1600s. Different name, same playbook. When an international monetary fund extends emergency loans to a developing nation in financial distress, look at the terms. Read the conditions attached to that credit. Open your markets, privatize state industries, restructure your budget, cut social spending. Debtor nations adjust their domestic policy to satisfy their foreign creditors. This is not a modern innovation. This is the Dutch bond market at planetary scale. Debt as architecture, debt as control. The corporations operating today with private security forces in foreign territories, the intelligence networks feeding commercial information to central bank decision makers before it reaches public markets, the supply management systems controlling what reaches market and at what price, the moral abstraction layer that keeps the people writing the checks separated from the consequences of what their capital is funding. These are not new innovations. They are Amsterdam, running the 21st century infrastructure. The key mechanics have not changed since 1602. Control the capital, control the information, control the supply chain, use debt to bind your counterparts. Use force when debt isn't sufficient, and make the machine look like freedom. Make it look like open markets. Make it look like opportunity. Give people a chance to buy shares. Tell them they're participating. Don't tell them who built the board. Don't tell them who printed the money that they had to use to sit at the table. The Dutch didn't invent capitalism. They built the architecture that capitalism now runs on. The rules weren't discovered. They were written, deliberately, by a small group of merchant regents in a city built on wooden stakes in a swamp. And those rules haven't fundamentally changed in 400 years. You've been expanded, refined, digitized, exported to every corner of the planet, but the playbook is the same. Now you've seen the ledger. Now you know the prototype. And you'll recognize it when you see it, because it never stopped running. It just changed its name. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want more Hidden Forces in History.